This presentation today is called Don't Bother Me, Mitigating Bots and Bad Actors in Online Autism Research. And this is something that actually came out of the Canadian Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey. I'll get a little more into how that came up, but this is sort of a cautionary tale as well as some suggestions for future work. There we go. First, I'd like to acknowledge the people who helped out with this project. So my research team, so Marina Shore and Simone Daniels, as well as the students who helped out. So I had a practicum student as well as some other student volunteers who helped out with various aspects of this project. So Samantha Rutherford, Silaxmi Sahu, and Rochelle Rosales. And then also I'd like to thank my supervisors, Dr. Stelios Georgiades and Dr. Jonathan Lai. The funders of this project are the Public Health Agency of Canada, the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, MyTax, and the Israeli Foundation. So, sorry, just trying to hide the fire here, but I don't think that's going to happen. So overall, research has increasingly moved online since the COVID-19 pandemic started. And there's a lot of reasons for this. Obviously, social distancing made in-person research quite difficult, especially in the health sphere. But also in disability research, you have better accessibility through online platforms. You have the potential for a much larger reach and potentially less logistical issues. However, this has led to a proliferation of bots and bad actors. Now, when I say bot, I mean an automated system that's programmed by someone to go through and fill out a survey or otherwise mimic human behavior to take part in research. And a bad actor is a human who may not be eligible for the survey in question, but trying to go through the survey either just to create chaos or otherwise get compensation that they may not be eligible for. And this proliferation is not domain specific. In reviewing the literature, we found articles from sociology, anthropology, psychology, medical research, health research, computer science, where these issues had come up, specifically with surveys. And surveys can be very vulnerable depending on how you set them up and how you want them to work. So previous studies that have been affected by bots and bad actors have advocated for both prevention and elimination measures. So you have your prospective measures that you do at the first place to try and prevent the bots from getting in, and then you have the retrospective look to try and clean the data you get afterwards. And most measures can fit into the following categories: those dealing with metadata, those dealing with survey design, inconsistent data, and suspicious activity. So a little bit about the Canadian Autistic Adult Needs Assessment Survey. This was a national survey of autistic adults aged 30 plus, and it was done online via Qualtrics and had an option for phone or paper surveys. It was 97 questions about 11 areas of life. It was in both French and English. It was open for 2 months. And $20 compensation was offered to each participant. So participants didn't have to take the money if they didn't want to. And there can be various reasons for that. Their disability benefits might be negatively affected if they were to take it, but people were given the option. And then the survey was advertised via emails sent out not only by McMaster, Autism Alliance of Canada, but also 15 community partners, community organizations who sent out emails and social media posts around this work to their memberships and beyond. We also did paid social media ads through Facebook and Instagram, which will be hereafter referred to as the Meta platforms. So Meta is the parent company. And otherwise, general social media posts from myself, from McMaster, from Autism Alliance of Canada, and these aforementioned organizations through X, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. So in terms of design elements that can prevent bots, these are ones that we included in this survey. We had a 2-step opt-in process, which was highly suggested but in the literature, but not really used that often. So and in a 2-step opt-in process, you sign up to receive a link, and then a link is sent to you, rather than just clicking on a link and being sent right into the survey. And then we later added bot logic questions to this process to try and increase the wall around the walled garden of the survey. We had a CAPTCHA test in the survey. So those are the types of tests, I'm sure you've seen them online, where you have to rearrange a picture to match something, or you have to select all of the motorcycles, but the picture only shows Vespas and you don't know what the heck they're talking about. So we did have a CAPTCHA test in the survey. No one reported back to say exactly what it looked like, but it was there. And then we had Qualtrics has an option called Relevant ID, which involves flagging for duplicate entries, ballot box stuffing, and fraud detection. So ballot box stuffing is when the same person is going through the survey again and again and again, but they're not necessarily duplicating their answers. And then duplicate entries, obviously looking at how similar the entries are to each other. And these flags all use features that the researcher doesn't necessarily have to see. So we did not collect IP addresses. However, to use this feature, it did look at the cookies of the person's browser when they were filling it out, the operating system they used, the IP address, but I did not have access to that information. That was all internal. All I was given was a number that would indicate the likelihood that a person fit into one of these categories. And then we had a honeypot question that was added 5 days post-launch. So a honeypot question is a question specifically for automated bots. And some automated bots will scrape a website before it loads. They'll go into the code of a website and they'll see everything, and then they'll automate how it fills it out. So for this honeypot question, it was a question that would appear in the website code, but when the website loads, it's hidden from the user. So if someone filled it out, it meant there was an automated thing looking at it. And the question was actually pretty innocuous, so that if it did get seen for whatever reason, it wouldn't trigger suspicions. So next thing, when did things get weird? So the survey launched on June 19th of 2023, and the ads on the Meta platform started the evening of June 22nd. June 23rd, we saw a spike in signups. We had almost 1,400 people sign up over the course of the 23rd of June, with up to 135 in an hour. I know that's when I emailed the group that was in charge of the advertising, going, "What's going on here? What do we do about this?" So the group that was managing the advertising, they talked to Meta about it, and Meta suggested that we change the ad campaign slightly. So switch through the ads more frequently, cut the distribution in off hours. And so that was implemented on June 26th. And then there was another large spike in signups on July 22nd, which corresponded with some changes to the recruitment process, as well as additional social media outreach. We were at the sort of 1 month mark. We were sending people out reminders and trying another ad push to get more people. So that's where that spike came from. And then we added additional bot logic questions that I referred to earlier to the sign up form on July 31st. So you can see that data point is green. And then the dramatic spikes sort of even out a little bit after that. So in total, we had 15,296 signups to receive a survey link. Now, the way we did this two-stage opt-in was people would fill out a Microsoft form, and then with their information, whether it be email, phone, or address, if they wanted a paper survey, and then I would manually send out batches. And it started with twice a day. And obviously when there were huge spikes, it was many more times a day that I was sending things out. But this actually, while it was labor intensive, it did serve a useful purpose. So we'd already started noticing with the enhanced signups and things like that, that there might be something a bit off. So about a month into the survey, we actually started reviewing the data originally to adjust the advertising campaign to maybe hit some demographics that we weren't getting responses from. In doing that, we noticed a few things that stood out. So there were strange amounts of unexpected answers. So we did not have any specific recruitment partners, distribution, ad campaigns targeted at Indigenous communities. However, 31.6% of respondents in the survey identified as Indigenous, when the national percentage is 5%. And then those living, there was a question about whether someone lives in a remote or isolated community. And 26% of our survey samples said they did versus 11%, according to Stats Canada. So we also noticed other inconsistent information, but these were the ones that really stuck out as things that we really wanted to, we knew there was something going on. We had to look and see why this was happening and why that happened. And I'll go into a little more detail why those two in particular were standing out. So in an attempt to prevent more bots and sort of stem the tide of people coming into the survey that were not doing it for the right reasons necessarily, we wanted to take some steps to try and adjust how we were going to deal with bots. And the consent form that we originally had was a bit vague on what we were going to do about bots. I did talk about if you're identified as a bot, we may not compensate you, but it wasn't necessarily phrased quite that clearly. So on the advice of various people, we changed the consent form to more clearly state that. And a reconsent process was started for the people who had already participated by that point, which was about 2,600 people. And so for the reconsent, they were sent the changed information and they were given 3 options. They could withdraw from the study, they could opt out of being compensated, or they could agree to the changes. And due to email limitations that I did not know existed, the emails had to be sent in batches. So I tried to send it to everybody at once. It got to about 600 people, and then my email account was locked for 2 days, which was a very stressful time because it was on a Friday night and it didn't get fixed until Monday morning. And I had a lot of angry emails to respond to once that happened. So the response to the first batch was generally strongly negative. I got a lot of very angry people. Some people were very positive about it, and they said, "Yeah, bots are everywhere. We deal with this, no problem. Like I reconsent." And so, with the help from the Hamilton Integrated Research Ethics Board, we changed the procedure a little bit for everyone else. So we created a letter allowing people to opt out. We explained the new change and then allowed people to opt out rather than forcing people to reconsent. And this was much better received. So one thing we noticed that was interesting was that more people responded to the reconsent form than it had been sent to in the first place. So 573 people were sent to the reconsent form and 285 people reconsented who were not sent that form. So later found out why that was when one of the people, he claimed to not be a bot master, but he knew a guy who knew a guy who was, and he emailed me with a screenshot showing an email with 22 identical emails from me, some of the emails we send out in reminders of the study showing, yes, people are taking advantage of this. I know because some guy told me. So we knew something was up, and the question then was, what do we do about it? So we wanted to, again, update our initial opt-in, our 2-stage opt-in process. So unfortunately, Microsoft Forms does not support CAPTCHA. So we couldn't implement that on the opt-in side. However, we added 2 questions to try and eliminate bots on July 31st. So we added a question about cultural logic. It was a question about animals that we felt was reasonably universal. And then we added a numerical logic question, and not a particularly difficult one. But we were cognizant of the fact that we were dealing with autistic adults who may or may not have additional cognitive challenges. We didn't want to make something that would inordinately affect legitimate people trying to participate. So in total, 75 signups failed the first question, 75 failed the second question out of 3,841. And 1 signup failed both questions, and 1 person who signed up failed one of the questions, but then emailed individually to ask for a link. So that could have been a case of mistake, or our questions were not as universal as we'd hoped. So in total, 24% of the signups happened after making this change to the sign-in process. So in terms of overall statistics for our opt-in and distribution, there were 15,296 people who, or shouldn't say people, but 15,296 signups happened requesting survey links. Survey links were sent to 14,908 of them. So the discrepancy there is the people who failed the bot questions didn't get sent. Duplicate email addresses were not sent. More than one link, and any suspicious emails. After we started instituting the bot questions, we looked through some of these emails, and we saw that there were people who signed up in batches saying John Doe 1 at domain, John Doe 2, John Doe 3, John Doe 4, and so we didn't send out ones to those people. We never heard back from them. So I'm guessing that they weren't that interested. And then, so 8,220 surveys were started, 7,871 online surveys were finished, and 41 phone or paper surveys were completed. So we then started to look at, well, now we've got all these surveys. What do we do now? So in our compensation model, we had, if someone, at the end of the survey, they were asked if they would like to be compensated. If they selected no, all done, survey is done, nothing else happens. If they selected yes, they had to create a self-generated ID code, a 14-digit one. So 7 questions, all like 2-digit answers. So like, what are the first 2 letters of your favorite color? And what are the first 2 letters of your favorite, or first 2 digits of your favorite number, and things like that. And then they would, after they're creating this code, they would be told to copy it, write it down. They would get a link to go to another form where they would put in that code, as well as some personal information where we could know where to send their gift cards to. Now, we did digital gift cards, which turned out to be that could have been one of the reasons why people targeted the survey the way that they did. This same person who knew a guy who had a screenshot had mentioned that if we did physical gift cards and needed a real address, that would really put a crimp in this sort of strategy. So something to consider for future. So in this compensation form, we collected names, email addresses, physical addresses, and phone numbers, as well as the compensation code, because that way we could link the survey to the compensation information to prove that they participated. And we noticed some interesting contradictions there. We had phone numbers that did not have 7 digits. We had international phone numbers. We had phone numbers with area codes that do not exist. We had a lot of 555 numbers. So 555 numbers are always used in TV and movies because they're not used in real life. So we had a lot of 555 numbers. We had addresses to vacant lots. We had addresses to intersections. We had addresses that Google Maps just couldn't find. So at one point we did try to go through the addresses, but it was too much of an in-depth process to try and do that. But there was a lot of inconsistencies that we saw. And then in terms of people participating, there were 4 ways that we disqualified people right off the bat. So if they answered the honeypot question, they were out. If there were 3 screening questions, basically asked, are you autistic? Yes, no. Are you 30 years of age or older? Yes, no. And then we asked for the first 3 digits of postal code, and then we asked for we asked one other question as well. So if you failed any of those questions, it just kicked you out of the survey, saying thank you for your time, but this is not for you. If they put their age as something under 30, so they would, on the screening, they'd say they were over 30, but then they'd fill it out and say they were 22. So we had to exclude them. And then the ballot box stuffing tag, which the ballot box stuffing tag, the honeypot question, they weren't used that often. They added to it, but not in a huge way. So 7 people got flagged by the honeypot question out of 7,900. So where do we go from here? What do we do? So starting with the compensation form, we looked through the provided information and we looked through the linked survey information, and we came up with a list of possible indicators or flags of a bot or bad actor. And these flags were organized into tiers, and the number and tier of flags dictated whether an entry was likely legitimate, likely a bot, or unable to tell. We called those the borderline cases. And in establishing these tiers and the types of flag, we came up with the flags initially, and then Marina and Simone and myself as a group, we came to a consensus and spent a couple of afternoons sort of going, okay, what is the likelihood that this person's a bot based on this information alone or based on this combination of information? And so we created a schema for doing that. So the goal was to remove as many bots from the data as possible while minimizing the chance of accidentally flagging a legitimate participant. And this distinguishes us a bit from other techniques for mitigating bots in surveys, where other studies have focused on just making sure the data is as pure as possible, even risking excluding legitimate data, whereas we want to minimize that as much as possible, with also the understanding that if people might answer things in an inconsistent way just by misunderstanding the question, not because of anything nefarious, especially when you have a population that might have different cognitive abilities, levels of education. So we want to be aware and understanding of that. So this is the schema we came up to with our tiers. So we moved from red to orange to yellow to green in a very hierarchical, scary Excel formula type of process. So red were obviously the most severe flags. So if you had even one red flag, you were borderline right away. If you had red and one of either orange or yellow, you were considered bot. If you had a red and 3+ of green, you were considered a bot. And then orange and yellow and green. So this is the schema we came up with, and it worked out fairly well, but it was really, I've explained this a number of times, and I don't think I've ever done a great job. People seem to be very confused whenever I bring this up, and it is confusing. And it's a very hierarchical system, and it's just how my mind works. So this is what I came up with, and I'll show you some examples of what the different types of flags were, and you can let me know whether it makes sense or not. So in terms of red flags, we use some of the Qualtrics relevance ID information. So a duplicate score of 80 or above, a fraud score of 30 or above. If they reconsented despite not having been emailed the reconsent form, if they had identical starting and ending times to anyone else in the survey, if they had identical starting times and durations rounded to the nearest 10 seconds, if they were younger than the diagnosis they reported. So if they said they were 30, but they were diagnosed at 45, that was a sign, that was probably not an accident. And we did some linguistic analysis on a selection of qualitative questions. So in the autistic community, there's a preference for identity first language. So autistic person versus person first language, like person with autism. So instantly, whenever we saw person first language, we sort of wonder, okay, what's going on here? Because a lot of autistics don't like that kind of language. It's not universal, but generally it's a large majority that prefers identity first language. But also, a lot of these were written in the third person. And these were questions about, how did your diagnosis affect your life in one of these 6 areas? So it's a very personal question, but the responses would be, that we'd see that would be flagged like this, would be things like, autistic people struggle with employment. Okay, what about you? What does that have to do with diagnosis? Like, an example of a red flag would be if 5 or 6 of the 6 qualitative questions had these sorts of text issues. And then orange, I believe, was 3 or 4, and then yellow was 1 to 2. And in some cases, some people had a great time with ChatGPT trying to fill these out. We had more than one participant I'm pretty sure, got an essay written in ChatGPT and then cut and paste each paragraph into a different question, because it looked in some cases like you could string them together and it would somewhat make sense. In terms of orange flags, we looked for survey duration of less than 10 minutes. When we developed this with our 10 lived experience partners, the shortest time it took for people to complete it was around 30 minutes. And then it turns out the median time to complete was about 45 for the actual participants. So less than 10 minutes, you probably skipped through as much as possible. If a reCAPTCHA score was under 0.5, if they had identical starting times, but not necessarily identical ending times or duration, if they claimed to live in a remote area, but they provided a postal code for an urban area. We had a lot of people who put postal codes for Toronto, but said they lived 350 kilometers away from a government center, which didn't make much sense. So we had certain postal code prefixes that we knew were definitely not going to be remote or isolated. So we used that as the criteria. Duplicate addresses or phone numbers. So this was an orange flag, not a red one, because what if you had multiple autistic people in the same family filling this out, or people in a group home situation? If they had duplicate answers in 2 to 3 of the 6 qualitative questions, we had people who gave very detailed answers, but it was like they copied and pasted it for each one. And then we had a table where people could write in their needs in terms of physical health, mental health, and employment. So the table had a list of necessities, and then they had to rate whether they had what they need, whether they had some but needed more, whether they didn't have what they need, or whether they didn't need it at all. And there were 3 write-in options for each of those tables. And we had a lot of people who left those write-in options blank, but then said, I have some but need more. And it was like, have some but need more of what? So we looked at how often those occurred. So out of 9 potential issues, 5 plus was an orange flag. For yellow flag, if you had an email address with no vowels, lots of K's and F's and D's and G's, but no vowels, where you could just sort of go down the home row and probably not hit a vowel at all. If your postal code did not match the province you lived in, if your survey duration was less than 20 minutes, if you said that you moved to another province for developmental services, but you did not indicate that you lived in any other provinces, if you had a duplicate name, understanding that some names are going to be more common than others. For green flags, if your name did not match your email, the way this was done was we looked at whether the first or last 3 letters of either your first or last name were found as a coherent string in your email address. So that could, if you had a short form, so instead of Catherine Fraser at gmail.com, it might be cat, insert additional information here at gmail.com. And so this would not flag that because it's three letters. If they gave an invalid phone number, as I mentioned, the ones that are international or aren't complete, if they indicated that they use sign language to communicate, but did not list a sign language when asked what languages they used. And then if they indicated they were working, but not that they were making money from work, and vice versa. If they said they were making money from work, but then said they weren't working. So we ranked these as lower because these might be more prone to mistake rather than identical start times and durations and things. So for people who did not wish to be compensated, we didn't have as much information to use for them. So some of the flags didn't apply. However, many of them still did, especially the metadata type ones. So looking at durations and starting times and things. So we used the same flags as much as we could at the same tier levels, and these are what we had. So for those who requested compensation, 21% were legitimate, 5% were borderline, 72% were bots, 2% were disqualified, and then several others were duplicates or withdrew. And then for those who declined compensation, 70% were legitimate, 24% were bots, 1% were disqualified or answered the honeypot question, and 3% were screened out. So, so while some people, while the instinct is that, well, if they're not asking for compensation, they must be legitimate. That's not necessarily true, especially for a long survey. If you're having an automated process go through it, there's a chance that it will select the wrong option when it gets to that question. And so we ended up doing a third round because when we did the initial check for the people who did compensation, we only compared the data set of those who selected compensation. We did not match it to the larger data set. So in sort of seeing some of the patterns we did in the non-compensation side, we then went back, all of the people who had not, or all of the entries that had not been disqualified or identified as bots were reviewed against the entire data set. And this was not only for the borderline cases, but also for the previously identified as legitimate cases. And so we wanted to look at more detail in the qualitative responses, and we found an interesting pattern of batches. So you'd have multiple surveys with very similar durations within 1 to 3 minutes of each other, submitted in sequence, usually at an off hour, that had extremely similar demographic information. So you might have 10 entries over 7 minutes that have very similar durations, and out of 6 or 7 demographic questions, 5 of them might be identical. And one of the quirks of the Qualtrics system is that the very first entry does not get marked as a duplicate because the process is not retrospective. So when things are marked as duplicate, it's because something before has happened that it's considered a duplicate of. So that initial one would count as legit. It wouldn't be flagged by Qualtrics. So this identified a number of those. So any responses that we were still unsure about after going through this process again were discussed until consensus was reached. This led to 199 responses that were originally classified as legitimate to be changed to bots. 114 borderline responses were coded as legitimate, and 239 were coded as bots. And from the end of the survey until the data set was fully coded for invalid responses, took approximately 7 weeks, and that's a team of 3 of us. And that included developing the procedure and cleaning the data for use. So it's definitely a big problem, and it can take a lot of time to fix. So in overall results, we had 1,912 legitimate responses, including 41 paper or phone surveys. We had 6,000 invalid responses. So those are responses that were coded as bots, screened out, disqualified, or withdrew. So an email was then sent out to the 5,201 respondents who requested compensation and who were identified as bots, and gave them the opportunity to contest this with a Zoom call with the camera on. 2 people asked to opt out of compensation to allow their data to be used because they didn't want to be verified. 23 people responded negatively or otherwise, and by otherwise, I mean I got blank emails from people. The negatively involved several threats of lawsuits and various threats of a personal nature. And then 5 people requested to verify. 1 was legitimate. 1 was clearly reading off a script to try and answer my questions, and the questions that they gave were not particularly coherent. And the other 3, I'm pretty sure, were the same person. And that one person logged in for 1 Zoom call, would not turn their camera on, and when I started asking probing questions, they dropped it, and the other 2 people didn't show up. So that's why I'm thinking they might be the same person. So overall, as you can see, we had, while this has excluded a fair number of people, very few people actually challenged that. So I'm pretty confident that we avoided excluding an inordinate amount of legitimate participants using this method, although the method is labor intensive. So here are some suggestions for dealing with bots in future surveys. Plan ahead. So I had heard of bot issues going on in other surveys, and that's why I'd included some in the survey design elements. I did not realize the extent of the issue at the outset. It's always going to be worse than you assume it to be. Just if you go with that, then that'll help you with your planning. The 2-step opt-in, while it was more labor intensive, having to manually go in, including when I was away on vacation for a week, having to go in and manually send people survey links, that excluded 46% of the signups. And since no one contacted to fix it, they probably weren't legitimate in the first place. So that's a pretty, while it's labor intensive, it's a way to significantly cut down on the bots you're dealing with after the fact. CAPTCHA and other bot detection, if you can do it in the opt-in and the survey itself, that would be ideal. Track IP addresses. We didn't do this here. The suggestions that we had when we were designing it was, no, don't track IP addresses. You can't do anything with them, and it's a violation of privacy, and it's very personal information. Yes, it is, but it also makes dealing with bots a lot easier, because you can see, oh, and some people may use VPNs to try and to fudge their IP addresses, but so it's not a silver bullet by any means, but it definitely makes things easier. And then don't make your personal phone number available. So I did, and because I don't have an office phone, but I have, according to my text messages, there are so many warrants out for me from the CRA that I must be number one on their most wanted list. I get easily 6 to 8 scam texts a day. Yeah, it's not pleasant. And then ask for the same information in different ways, in different parts on the survey, not on the same page. So for example, in the screening part of the survey, we asked for the first 3 digits of the postal code, and then 3 pages later, we asked, which province do you live in? And you'd be surprised, there were several thousand people who messed that up. So if it's on the same page, then it's easier to be consistent, for them to be consistent, but it's on different pages, ask them at different times, and in slightly different way. That's one way to work around that. Set the answer orders variably. So don't always have the most positive or most likely response list first. This is why I think the Indigenous ethnic status and the remote and isolated questions came out the way they did, because in the ethnicity question, Indigenous options were listed first. They were the first 3 response options. And then for the remote or isolated area, the question is, do you live in a remote or isolated area? Here are the definitions of remote and isolated. So the answers were yes, remote, yes, isolated, or no. So no is the one you would likely see most often, but because it was first, it's easy when you're clicking through a survey, you just click the first couple of options. So I'm sure there is a way that you could go in and check how many of the first options did they pick, second options, so what have you, but we decided not to go in that way for fear that we would capture too many people in the mistake train, not the blatantly illegitimate train. And then look at the qualitative responses for impersonal language. So ChatGPT has made some of these qualitative responses quite humorous, but and some of the ChatGPT stuff is really easy to identify, at least the stuff that we found. It was very easy to identify as, this is not likely written by a human. This grammatically does not make sense, or this semantically, the meanings is not there, or it doesn't relate to the question being asked. And it can be quite telling, although a lot of these cases were other qualitative responses were not looked at because they tended not to fill them out. The people who were identified as bots tended to only fill out these particular 6 questions because they were the only questions on a particular page. So rather than skipping it, they filled them all out. So if you want to force people to do a qualitative question, if you think they're a bot, put some qualitative questions on a page by themselves and let them try to figure out how to answer it to get by you. And then consider other compensation mechanisms. So physical gift cards, based on what hacker McHackerson emailed me. Physical gift cards could be one way of dealing with it. Also, a lottery or a draw. So I was a consultant on another autism survey in Canada that was done after this one. And so I told them about some of my issues with bots. And so they did a draw. So they offered people who completed the survey, there were $150 gift cards. And so if you filled out the survey, you had a chance of getting a gift card. So they had a 3 times lower rate of invalid responses than I did. So my rate was close to 75, 76%. Theirs was 26%. So that change in and of itself made a big difference. So thank you very much for your time and attention, and I open it up to questions.